Hey everyone, welcome to the channel Chess Professor. Today I will be showing you the Latvian Gambit which comes after these moves e4, e5 and then knights f3. Now here you can either proceed you with some normal knight c6, Petrov defense knight f6 or some gambits, etc. But instead you can also play the murderous move pawn to f5. So of course this moves aren't a brilliant move, but not gonna lie, the Latvian gambit is a strong and aggressive opening, and this can be used to avoid theory. So here your opponent may go for bishop to c4, capturing on f5, capturing on e5, which are the three main options, or play pawn to d3, and the last option, which is playing knight to c3, starting starting with bishop to c4. So after your opponent moves bishop to c4, you can just capture this pawn. If your opponent recaptures, now there is a very important move which is queen to g5. Now, if your opponent plays this fork looking for the rook, we can capture this pawn on g2. The rook has to slide away, and then pawn to d5 comes. Your opponent would usually try to capture, but after that you can play this murderous move, which wins the queen on the next move. But the only chances for white is to just block with the pawn, and after this we play the this calm move bishop to e7. Now here, if our opponent captured this bishop, this is just a mate in two, and your opponent can't capture the pawn because of the same mate in two. So your opponent can play the move queen to e2. This is the only move which saves from checkmate. But even after this, we can play king to h4, and then we can trade queens, and after that bishop takes f3. Now, even even though our trap has failed, if we see, now we have two murderous bishops and a centralized opponent king, which is about to get checkmated. This variation of the Latvian gambit is known as the Mayotte attack. Now here we have played this brilliant move pawn to f5. After this, let me first cover the uncommon options, starting with knight to c3. We can just capture this pawn, and as assumed, our opponent will of course recapture, as he brought the knight out for this only. Then we can push our pawn. Now in either knight moves, we can just easily push pawns, and now we will just keep pushing pawns until we get a space advantage. And then, for example, let me show you. Now if you see, you can see the space advantage we have got, and now we can just start developing. Or there is an even better move. Just kidding, of course. This bishop can capture. Now after this we can just start developing our minor pieces, and if you see, you can just see the space advantage we have, and also our opponent can't do anything about it. Our opponent can't develop the knight, can't push the pawn, can't develop. He can only develop the bishop. But even after this, our opponent can just castle and do literally nothing, and we are in a much better position. Now, a better alternative to this move is pawn to d3. After this, we can play knight to c6. Now, if you know, this looks somewhat something like the Vienna Gambit, if you know. But still, This is a Latvian Gambit, even though it just shows Reti opening Dutch variation if you see it somewhere else. But it is a Latvian Gambit. After this, your opponent may develop, you also develop, and now your main task will be, now you pin this knight, and now your main task will be just to develop your pieces and then castle. Easy, and then you can, and then either if your opponent castles queen side or king side, you can go for the pawn push if you want to instead of castling. Now, next, the brilliant move, and after that, your opponent. Now, the two most common moves which I was talking about. First move, pawn captures f5. After that, you can push the pawn to e4. Now, there are two options. Your opponent's knight can hop to d4 or to e5, starting with d4 as it is the most common move. Then after this, you have to just know one important move, knight to f6. Why? Because if we have just played something else, for an example, anything, after this, white can give us this dangerous check, and we can't even block because of this pawn capture, and we can't even recapture because or else this rook will be hanging. So we have to remember this important move, which is knight to f6, which blocks this h5 check. After that, let's suppose your opponent played something. Now you have to just push pawns, push pawns, push pawns, and just take the space advantage which you have. Because if you even see here, your opponent's position is cramped. Only this bishop can develop and this knight. Rest everything is just trapped inside. So now after this your main motive will be just to play aggressively. For example, you can capture the center pawn, and after that you can move d5, which creates this difficulty and this difficulty, meaning that you are also threatening for this fork and also threatening to capture the pawn, and there is no way to save both of them. So let's suppose the bishop moves. Now you can just capture the pawn, or even better is not this, just capture the pawn, and after that castle, develop pieces, castle, and go for an attack. King, if king side castling, king side attack, and if your opponent castles queen side, a queen side pawn push. And now here, if your opponent plays this, just remember this move, and after that your opponent will usually play d4. Now you can play pawn to d6. This knight will move, and see now you have two pieces developed. You have the whole center. Your opponent's position is completely cramped. You even have an open F file. I didn't told about this. In all the almost all the variations except that D3 variation, you will have an open F file, semi-open F file for your rook. Now, the second most common move after pawn to f5 is capturing this pawn on e5. Now, you have many options, but the best one is to go queen to f6. Now, here your opponent may think, oh, I can give this check. But after that, you block, and if you see, this is attacked, and your opponent can't even capture, or you can just capture with the pawn if you want to. Why? Because this rook can't be captured, because this rook can't be captured because this queen is defending the rook. Easy. So now let's suppose our opponent doesn't played this move and played something else. Let's suppose push the pawn, then you can just get rid of the knight, because it is standing on your side of your board and you have to get rid of it. The knight moves, and then you can capture this pawn. Easy. If you see, you haven't developed queen, you haven't space it, you have the center, you can push the pawn anytime for even more space advantage. You can easily develop your pieces, except the fact that your opponent can't easily, of course, he can. And also you have this open f file, as I mentioned. In every variation we will get the semi open f file. Now let me show you an example game so that you can play this opening perfectly. So starting pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight f3, f5, our brilliant Latvian gambit. Latvian gambit got accepted, pawn captured on f5, you push e4. The opponent pushed e4. Knight, knight comes to d4 and black played knight to f6. After that, bishop to c4. I covered this move, but it is nothing. This is also a common move, and you will see how to tackle this. Pawn to c5, as I told you to push pawns. After that, knight comes to b3. Then you push this pawn on d5. Now you might think that the bishop will retreat, but instead white played bishop to b5 check. Now here you can just develop the knight to c6, and then after this you have also gotten semi-open b5. Even though black didn't use it, why? Because opponent castled on king side. Now this pawn got captured. Now see our space advantage, as I told you. This would usually happen in games where your opponent's position will be completely crumpled. Also, you have not many, two developed pieces. Meanwhile, there is one developed piece for white which can't even move anywhere, or else it will just get captured. Now after this, rook to e1. White thought that he could put his rook on the semi-open file, but bishop to d6. Now, as I told you, we have to play aggressive. So we are only playing aggressive. Why? Because this bishop is aiming on this important square towards the king side. Now, pawn to d3. Now, also you could not capture this time because this pawn is pinned to the king. So black sacrificed the bishop. This is not a brilliant move, of course, but this is not gonna lie the best move which black could play in this moment. So let's just mark it as a brilliant move. King takes on h2, then knight g4 check. Queen can't take, or else bishop would take. After this, king to g1 and this. Now, now black is threatening and very horrifying check on h2. White covered it by f4, but instead this pawn got captured, and then then black captured the bishop. Now the only move here to the two there were only two moves to save, and only one move to save this position, which was queen takes on g4. Now even though this saved the checkmate, but still we still have an 8.3 advantage according to Stockfish. This was also a good move, not gonna lie, but still, this is not as good as this. But White couldn't find all these moves and just blundered mate in 3 by playing king to g1. Now, if White had played something else, this would be just an easy checkmate on h2. King to g1, and then after that, h2 check. Mate in 2 incoming, f1 on forced. In the real blunder is this. Why? Because this blunders mate in 3, as I told you. h2, h1, and then finally finishing off the game with the queen at g2, checkmating the white king. Now, now this is how you can play the game. Thanks for watching, and if you like the video, please like it and subscribe the channel if you are new to it, and share to other people. Thanks for watching.